Joining us now, Senator Tim Kaine, Democrat, Virginia, junior senator from Virginia, according to Mark Warner. Senator, great to have you.
Hey, John, thanks. Mark does say junior every time he introduces me, so I'm very used to that.
Every time, isn't it? I mean, it's just, he says it every single time.
Well, that's part of our fun relationship, and I always say, you're right, I am 3 years younger than you.
See, it's always good. Always got to look at that bright side, right?
Absolutely.
All right, Senator, I want to get to the Iranian situation. Start there. Let's start with the letter written by 47 Republicans, defended Sunday by John McCain and others, but an unprecedented move. It even looked to a lot of conservatives like me like just handstanding, but also it sets a very dangerous precedent. Am I right?
John, you are right. I think it really kind of expressed contempt for the office of the president, in my view. We need to be engaged in an effort to make sure Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon, and we've got to exhaust all diplomatic options. First, because diplomacy is preferable to military options, and second, if we ever were to need to use a military option, we would have to be able to look at everybody and say we exhausted all diplomatic alternatives.
Right. And
this really looked like an effort to tank negotiations that are in their final phase. There's a right way and a wrong way for Congress to be involved. I am a co-sponsor of a bill that says let the negotiators do their job. God bless them. Hope they get a fantastic deal. But after they get a deal, bring it back to Congress, and we will do a deliberate and careful review of the deal. That is the right way for Congress to be involved. But to do it in a partisan way and try to undercut the president during the midst of a negotiation, there's no good that will come out of it and a lot of bad that could come out of it.
Now, Senator, we're in agreement on that. The substance of the letter, though, when you look at the substance, like if it was sent, say, to President Obama instead of Iranian leaders, can you talk about the substance of what was in there and the concerns that Republicans have that Obama is giving away the store?
Look, there are a lot of concerns about the deal. Now, the first thing, John, I'll say is, of course, there's no deal yet. So efforts to tank the deal, or Prime Minister Netanyahu stood up in Congress and said, this is a bad deal. No, there's not a deal yet. Don't trash it until there's a deal. But there were some points raised in the letter, and there were some points raised in Prime Minister Netanyahu's speech, which are valid. Namely, this is high-stakes poker with Iran, and a bad deal in some ways is worse than no deal. And so we have to be very careful about a deal because Iran is not only, been potentially pursuing nuclear weapons, but they are definitely engaged in terrorist activity throughout the region. So, and I point that the senators made in the letter, namely that, look, an executive agreement is not binding on a future president or future Congress is correct. What Iran wants is they want out from under sanctions imposed by Congress. We want them to give up nuclear weapons capacity, and they want out of sanctions imposed by Congress. And if that's what they want, Congress has got to have a say. Mm-hmm. So Congress will be involved in this deal at some point. The only question is when and how, and that's why Senator Corker and I and 14 of our colleagues, 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, have introduced a bill to say if there is a deal, Congress should have a, kind of a defined process for how it gives careful consideration of the deal.
Now, if the deal is made, can you just share with our audience, Senator Kaine, that let's say there's going to be a new president in 2017, and that president doesn't think that particular arrangement is going to make sense. Can it be unraveled, or is it a done deal? Is it a
Well, that's a good question. My sense is it can be unraveled, at least to some degree. There are 3 kinds of sanctions that are currently imposed against Iran because of their nuclear program. There are executive sanctions imposed by the president. Now, those the President Obama does have the ability to waive or suspend those without congressional approval because they're executive only, and a future president would have the same ability. Second, there is a set of international sanctions imposed by the United States and other nations through the UN. Those also can be waived or suspended without Congress because they were not subject to statute. But the sanctions that have really bitten into the Iranian economy and gotten into the negotiating table are congressional in nature. And Congress granted to the president some ability to waive or suspend sanctions. And so the president could do that, but the next president could decide, no, I want to reimpose them, and that would be within the next president's purview. But bottom line, as I've said, because the main sanctions that are at issue here are congressional in nature, the president can't just get rid of them without Congress. So Congress will be involved in this deal, and the only question is, will we be bipartisan, deliberate, thoughtful, or will we be rushed, partisan, and careless? And of course, I think a deliberate and careful process is important for a deal that has such important national security stakes.
But it sounds like what you're saying, Senator Kaine, either way, you believe that Congress is going to have a role, right?
Yes, but let's wait till the deal is done. We don't need to be trying to tank the negotiations. Let the negotiators do their very best job. And there are some aspects of the deal that concern me that I'm hearing about, but there are also some aspects of the deal, intrusive inspections and some other aspects that I'm hearing about that are very, very positive. But the negotiator always saying nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And so we just need to wait and see what kind of deal they bring to the table, and then we'll have the opportunity to give it the review that it needs.
Kaine, Senator, you have been a tireless advocate of the president coming to Congress and asking for an authorization for war. As you know, I'm on the same side of this issue with you right now. Today, as we're speaking, bombs are dropping. There's no authorization for anything. What's the status update now?
John, you're right. We are now in the 8th month of a war that began on August the 8th against ISIL. There's been no congressional debate on the floor of either house. In the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where I serve, we passed an authorization out of committee in December that died at the end of the 113th Congress. But the White House did finally send up a proposed authorization. We have been having a series of hearings about their proposal, both in the Armed Services and the Foreign Relations Committees. We kind of finished our hearings last week with a very important hearing with Secretaries Kerry and Carter and Joint Chiefs, the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey. And we are now about to start debating in the Foreign Relations Committee the President's proposal. There is a strong bipartisan majority in both houses that believes the United States should be taking military action with other nations against ISIL. There are some important differences on details. I don't want to minimize those, but given the strength of the bipartisan support for U.S. military involvement in this mission, we should be able to craft an ultimate authorization that is successful. It will probably be a little bit different than the one the White House sent over, but we should be able to get close and be bipartisan.
So, Senator, what happens if it doesn't pass?
Well, that's a real good question. Then you're in, I think you're in I described it at the hearing last week, is if we don't do an authorization, I think we're in a kind of a legal and precedential catastrophe because we are in the midst of a war. The president maintains that he has the ability to undertake this military action because of the authorizations for military force against al-Qaeda that was passed in 2001 and to engage in military action in Iraq that was passed in 2002. Many of us believe that those authorizations clearly don't cover this action, and that's why a new authorization is needed. So there's sort of a stalemate between those of us in the legislative branch who don't think the action is currently covered and the president who believes that it is. But I do think even the White House now understands that this military campaign is likely to be long and protracted. And so, for a while they were saying we don't need an authorization, and then they said, well, we would welcome an authorization, but they weren't doing anything to push it along. But now they really are working to help us get to the point of authorizing. I think it would be somewhat disastrous if we don't pass one. I think we owe it to the troops that are out there fighting this horrible enemy to give them bipartisan support, but we just have to work hard to make that happen.
What's the end game here? I mean, 3,000 troops or 5,000
The end game in terms of the military mission.
Yeah, what's the end game?
I think this war against ISIL is kind of a two-step, which isn't unusual. It's going to be phased. Like I always say about World War II, when we decided to go to war against Germany, we didn't invade Germany. We went to North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy, then we came in through Western Europe, and eventually got to Germany. This is going to be phased as well. So I think phase one is trying to work with the Peshmerga, the Kurdish military force, and the Iraqi military to stabilize the situation in Iraq, to push ISIS back, defeat them in Iraq, protect the borders between Iraq and Syria, protect the borders between Syria and other states like Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon. The second and more challenging phase of this battle against ISIL is to battle them in Syria, their headquarters. They're headquartered in the city of Raqqa, Syria. And that is much more complicated because of the ongoing Syrian civil war against Bashar al-Assad. So that makes the Syrian situation very much more difficult. But while we are focusing the battle in Iraq, we are training up Syrian moderate forces to tackle ISIL there. They are engaging in military action in cities in Syria. We're providing humanitarian aid in Syria. And so I think phase one is Iraq, and then phase two is Syria. And at some point in this development, we have to look for a way to negotiate an end to the Syrian civil war. And that's a very important component that will not happen immediately, but that the Syrian civil war has now produced the largest humanitarian crisis since World War II, just in terms of the millions of people that have been displaced by it.
Well, 1.3 million refugees just in Lebanon, aside from anything else.
Yep, absolutely.
I mean, and there's no end to that in sight either. Hey, I wanted to just get, if I can, Senator, clarification. Some people refer to ISIS as ISIS. You refer to it as ISIL. What's the difference and why?
Yeah, it's just, and a lot of folks are now referring to them by the Arabic phrase Daesh. I just use ISIL because they have territorial ambitions beyond Iraq and Syria. So ISIS is the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. ISIL is the Islamic State in the Levant, and they have territorial ambitions beyond Iraq and Syria to include Lebanon. And so I've just used the phrase ISIL, and then I kind of got stuck using that phrase, last summer and then summer of 2014, and I haven't changed. But they do definitely, in addition to Iraq and Syria, they have territorial ambitions that would take them into Lebanon as well. And so that is kind of they want to redraw the map of the world, consolidate a caliphate in what was called the Levant, and that's why I use that phrase.
All right, Senator, that makes sense. I want to go to the domestic front, if I may. The Supreme Court is going to rule in June on whether or not those receiving Obamacare subsidies can continue to get those subsidies if they're in states that do not have a state exchange, Virginia being one of them. We're talking about 8 million people right now that have either they're not paying for their insurance, it's being 100% subsidized, or it's being subsidized to some extent, I think average 75%. If that ruling comes down and says, this isn't going to work, you got 8 million people, what happens?
Well, that's a great question, John, and about 300,000 of them are in Virginia. So right at home, there's hundreds of thousands of folks who are at risk in the Supreme Court ruling. Well, first, I was not in Congress when the Affordable Care Act passed, but I did support it. And in looking at the statute, I think it's really clear that Congress intended that the subsidy be provided regardless of whether there was a state exchange or whether a state relied upon the federal exchange. And more than just Congress intended it, I think that's clear. I think even just the wording of the statute, if you don't get into the question of intent, the wording leads you to that same conclusion. Mm-hmm. If you look at the entire statute, you can pull out half of one sentence and say, oh, wow, this looks unclear. But if you read the entire statute, which the Supreme Court is bound to do in any question of statutory construction, they're obligated to look at the entire statute. I think it's clear that the subsidies are supposed to be provided regardless of who manages the exchange. But if the Supreme Court rules otherwise, it's very, very difficult. Millions of people who have insurance, most of whom have it for the first time in their lives, could lose it. And it would be up to Congress under the current majority to determine how to fix it so those folks don't lose insurance forever.
When President Obama did his executive amnesty for 4 or 5 million illegals, one of the things he said on TV, I think it was last November, he said, look, they're not going to be eligible for entitlements or benefits. Now we're finding out that these 4 or 5 million illegals that broke the law to get in the U.S., broke the law to work, that's 2 laws broken right off the bat, they could be eligible for earned income tax credits up to $24,000, Obamacare, now Social Security without having paid anything in. I mean, is that fair to the working men and women that are playing by the rules?
Well, John, first, I am not exactly sure that they are, in fact, entitled to any of those benefits. So I know that we're in our last minute, so I would just want to caution, I'm not confident that folks are entitled to these benefits, especially the Affordable Care Act, because I think it was quite clear that they were not entitled to those benefits. But regardless, let's jump to the end. I share with Republicans in the House the view that while I support the president's executive action, and I believe it's very much in character with what other presidents have done, I share the Republican view that let's not do it by executive action, let's legislate. And so in the Senate, we legislated in June of 2013, bipartisan immigration reform, and we have been waiting for now almost 2 years for the House to do something, anything. Clearly, they're not going to just pass the Senate bill, but they can pass their own immigration reform. They can pass one that repeals the president's executive actions and takes it in a different direction, and then we sit down at the conference table and hammer it out. But they have been unwilling to pass legislation. So if you don't like executive action, you've got a solution every day you walk into the office, which is to pass your own bill. The House hadn't been willing to do that.
And so what you're saying is along with that, yes, they could say, hey, no benefits are going to be eligible for basically illegal. That came
I think that would likely be part of the bill the House would pass, but they haven't passed one. So if they pass that, the Senate has a bill, then we sit down on the conference table, we try to find a middle ground position. I can even, frankly, think down the road and see what a middle ground position would be, but we can't get there if the House won't take up our bill, and they won't take up their own bill, and we're sitting in the Senate now waiting since June of 2013 for them to do anything.
All right, Senator Tim Kaine, we're out of time. Senator, as always, I want to thank you for being with us. Appreciate the time, and appreciate, as always, your candor. Thank you, sir, so much.
Look forward to talking soon. Thanks, Sean.